You're good. What agency are you with?
I'm the state attorney.
Alright. Thank you. Your tag didn't come back. Never seen that before. I'm sorry? Yeah. We're good now.
So it was...
We ran the tag. I've never seen it before. A Florida tag. It's never come back to anything before. So that's the reason for the stop.
What was the tag run for?
I'm sorry?
What was the tag run for?
Oh, we run tags all the time, whether it's at traffic lights and that sort of stuff. That's how we figure out if, cars are stolen and that sort of thing. Also, the windows were really dark. I don't have a tint measurer, but that's another reason for the stop.
Do you guys have cards on here?
Yeah, one second. Actually, this isn't my car, but I can write my name down if you'd like.
We like to believe that the law protects everyone equally, that a badge or a title or a position of authority shields you from the petty harassment that far too many people face during routine traffic stops. We tell ourselves that if you work hard, achieve success, and reach the highest levels of the legal profession, you'll be immune to the kind of profiling that plagues ordinary citizens. But the footage we're examining today shatters that comforting illusion. It proves that even being the state attorney, the chief prosecutor for an entire judicial circuit, the person who literally decides which cases get prosecuted and which don't, doesn't immunize you from what can only be described as a fishing expedition disguised as police work. This isn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how implicit bias, unchecked discretion, and the thin veneer of legal justification can collide with someone who actually knows the law inside and out. And when that happens, when an officer pulls over someone who can immediately recognize the flaws in their reasoning, the results are uncomfortable for everyone involved. Aramis Ayala is not your average motorist. She's not someone you can intimidate with legal jargon or confuse with vague references to probable cause. She's the first black state attorney elected in Florida's history, a groundbreaking achievement in a state with a complicated racial history. She's a lawyer with years of courtroom experience. She's a law professor at Florida A&M University, an HBCU where she teaches the next generation of attorneys how the criminal justice system actually operates, not how it's supposed to operate in textbooks, but how it functions in the real world, with all its imperfections and biases. She's spent her entire career inside the machinery of the criminal justice system, prosecuting cases, understanding procedure, cross-examining police officers, and evaluating whether stops and searches meet constitutional standards. So when two Orlando police officers pull her over on June 19th, as she's driving home from teaching class, they have absolutely no idea they've just stopped someone who can see through every word of their justification in real time, someone who knows exactly what reasonable suspicion actually means and can immediately recognize when it's absent. Let's break down what happened here step by step, because the officer's explanation unravels the moment you apply even basic scrutiny. The interaction begins normally enough. The officer approaches the vehicle and asks what agency she's with after looking at her license. This is already interesting because it suggests he's seen something on her identification that indicates official capacity. When Ayala responds that she's the state attorney, you can literally hear the shift in the officer's tone. He quickly says, "All right, thank you," as if preparing to end the interaction immediately. But Ayala, being an attorney who understands that this stop needs justification, asks the obvious question, why was I pulled over? The officer's first explanation is that her tag didn't come back. He emphasizes this point, saying he's never seen that before with a Florida plate, acting as though this is some bizarre anomaly that justified the stop. But here's the problem with that story, and it's a big one. Ayala's license plate was confidential. It was properly registered. It was entirely legal. Confidential plates are specifically used by judges, prosecutors, certain law enforcement personnel, and other officials whose positions might make them targets if their personal information were easily accessible. When you run a confidential plate through the system, it doesn't return the standard information that a normal plate would. That's not a glitch. That's not suspicious. That's the entire point of having a confidential plate in the first place. It's a security feature, not a red flag. So when the officer says the tag didn't come back, and he's never seen that before, what he's really admitting, perhaps without fully realizing it, is that he ran a plate, got a result that clearly indicated this was a protected vehicle. A vehicle being driven by someone in the law enforcement or judicial community, and he still decided to pull her over. Think about that for a moment. A confidential plate return is essentially the system telling the officer, this person is one of yours, this person is in the justice system, proceed with caution. And his response was to initiate a traffic stop anyway. That's not reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. That's curiosity. That's an officer seeing something unusual and deciding to investigate further, even though the unusual thing he observed was specifically designed to protect people in Ayala's position. That's not police work. That's a fishing expedition. But the officer doesn't stop there. He immediately pivots to a second justification, almost as if he realizes the first one sounds weak. He mentions that the windows are really dark. He admits, and this is crucial, that he doesn't have a tint meter to actually measure whether the windows violate Florida law. He just eyeballs it and decides they look dark. This is what we call a pretextual stop in legal terminology. It's when an officer uses a minor, often unverifiable violation as an excuse to initiate contact with a vehicle or a person, hoping to discover something else during the interaction. Maybe they'll smell marijuana. Maybe the driver will act nervous. Maybe there will be outstanding warrants. The initial justification is just the foot in the door. The problem here is that Ayala later confirmed in her public statement that the tint was completely legal under Florida statute. It wasn't even close to a violation. So now we have two justifications provided by the officer, and both of them fall apart under examination. The tag issue wasn't suspicious. It was a security feature working exactly as intended. The tint issue wasn't a violation. It was within legal limits. So what we're left with is an uncomfortable question. What was the real reason for this stop? But perhaps the most telling moment in this entire video isn't what the officer says to justify the stop. It's what he doesn't say, and it's how quickly the entire tone and trajectory of the interaction shifts the second Ayala identifies herself. Watch the body language. Listen to the voice. The officer's posture changes immediately. His cadence speeds up. He starts wrapping up the encounter as fast as humanly possible. Suddenly, this traffic stop that was so urgent and necessary just moments ago, this stop that required pulling over a vehicle for a tag issue he'd never seen before, and suspiciously dark windows, evaporates into thin air like morning fog. There's no ticket issued. There's no written warning. There's not even a verbal warning about getting the tint checked or having the plate looked at. Just a hurried, "All right, thank you, have a good day." And the officer is walking back to his patrol car. Think about what that rapid retreat actually means. If this stop was truly about a legitimate traffic violation, if the officer genuinely believed the tag was suspicious or the windows were illegally tinted, then Ayala's job title shouldn't matter one bit. The law doesn't care if you're a state attorney, or a college student, or a retire. A violation is a violation. If the tint is too dark, it's too dark regardless of who's driving. If the tag issue was genuinely concerning, It should still be concerning after learning she's a prosecutor. But that's not what we see here. What we see is an officer realizing in real time that he's made a catastrophic miscalculation. He's pulled over someone with institutional power, someone who understands the law better than he does, someone who can make his professional life very uncomfortable if this interaction is documented and scrutinized. And so he exits the situation as quickly as possible, hoping the whole thing will just go away. Now, let's talk about the broader pattern this video exposes, because this isn't really about one traffic stop or two officers, or even Aramis Ayala specifically. This is about a systemic issue that affects millions of people. During the conversation, the officer admits something that should alarm everyone. He says they run tags all the time, at traffic lights, randomly, just to see if cars are stolen or if something interesting pops up. This is the reality of modern policing in many jurisdictions across America. License plate readers mounted on patrol cars and traffic signals, mobile data terminals that can run hundreds of plates per hour, and the broad discretion given to officers create an environment where law enforcement can initiate contact with almost anyone at any time for almost any reason. The legal standard that's supposed to govern these interactions is called reasonable suspicion. It's supposed to be based on specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable officer to believe criminal activity is occurring or about to occur. But in practice, that standard has become so elastic, so flexible, that it's lost almost all meaning. A tag that doesn't return standard information becomes inherently suspicious, even when there's a legitimate reason for that result. Dark windows become probable cause for a stop, even without any measurement. Driving a nice car in a certain neighborhood becomes a factor. Being out late at night becomes relevant. And yes, unfortunately, the race of the driver becomes part of the unconscious calculus that officers use when deciding who to pull over and who to let pass by. This creates what criminal justice researchers call a discretionary funnel. At every stage of the interaction, officers have choices and they choose which cars to run plates on. They choose which plate results warrant further investigation. They choose which vehicles to pull over. They choose how to interpret ambiguous behavior. They choose whether to issue a warning or a ticket, or to let someone go entirely. And all of these choices, these hundreds of small decisions made every single day by thousands of officers, are influenced by human psychology, by implicit biases, by past experiences, and by cultural narratives about who looks suspicious and who doesn't. Aramis Ayala didn't just experience an inconvenience during this traffic stop. She didn't just lose 15 minutes of her evening. She experienced something far more significant. She experienced what millions of Americans, particularly Black Americans, face on a regular basis. The quiet indignity of being presumed suspicious until proven otherwise. The frustration of knowing you've done nothing wrong but having to justify your presence anyway. The humiliation of being singled out while others drive past without a second glance. The exhaustion of constantly having to prove you belong, that you're not a threat, that you have a right to exist in this space without harassment. The difference, the only real difference, is that Ayala had the legal knowledge, the professional standing, and the platform to call it out publicly. She didn't just comply and move on. She posted the video. She made a formal statement. She refused to let the moment disappear into the vacuum of unrecorded interactions that happen every single day across this country. Interactions that never make the news, that never get documented, that never face any scrutiny whatsoever. This video also forces us to confront an uncomfortable question that many people would rather avoid. If this can happen to a state attorney, someone with institutional power, legal expertise, name recognition, and connections throughout the criminal justice system, then what happens to everyone else? What happens to the people who don't know the law, who haven't spent years studying constitutional protections and the limits of police authority? What happens to the people who don't have the confidence to question an officer's justification because they've been taught their entire lives to comply immediately or face escalation? What happens to the people who fear, quite reasonably based on countless documented incidents, that pushing back or asking questions or asserting their rights will turn a traffic stop into something far worse, into handcuffs or violence or a trip to jail? The answer is simple and tragic. They comply. They hand over their license and registration without question. They accept the ticket or the warning even when they know it's unjustified. They apologize for things they didn't do. They internalize the message that they are inherently suspect, that their presence in certain spaces requires explanation, that they need to make themselves smaller and quieter and more compliant to avoid trouble. And the system continues unchecked, because if people don't complain, if they don't document, if they don't fight back, then as far as official records are concerned, nothing problematic happened. The officers in this video didn't break the law in any overt or prosecutable way. They didn't use force. They didn't make a false arrest. They didn't plant evidence or make threats. By the narrow legal standards that govern police misconduct, they did nothing wrong. But what they absolutely did do was abuse discretion. They used the enormous power granted to them by the badge, the power to detain people, to demand identification, to conduct investigations, to initiate the machinery of the criminal justice system, and they used that power to initiate contact without genuine legal cause. And when that contact didn't yield anything useful, when it became clear this was just a law-abiding citizen going about her business, they retreated quickly and quietly. That's the insidious part that makes this kind of interaction so difficult to address through traditional accountability mechanisms. There's no complaint that will go anywhere because technically, procedurally, nothing happened. No ticket was issued, so there's no court date where the stop could be challenged. No arrest was made, so there's no criminal case to be dismissed. No force was used, so there's no internal affairs investigation. Just a black woman pulled over for reasons that conveniently evaporate the moment she reveals who she is. Just another data point in the vast ocean of pretextual stops that happen millions of times per year. And here's what makes it even more frustrating. The officer's admission that they run plates all the time, randomly, just to see what comes up, reveals a fundamental truth about modern policing. The technology exists to surveil everyone constantly. Every car that passes a patrol vehicle or a license plate reader becomes a data point. Every plate gets run. Every result gets evaluated. And officers get to decide, based on whatever criteria they're using that day, who gets pulled over and who doesn't. There's no oversight of these decisions. No review board examining why Officer A pulled over 20 cars this month and Officer B pulled over 200. No analysis of whether the discretionary stops are distributed evenly across racial and economic lines or concentrated in certain communities. Ayala's case made national news precisely because it was so visible, and because she had the platform to make it visible. CNN covered it. CBS covered it. Legal analysts debated it. The Orlando Police Department had to respond publicly. But for every Aramis Ayala, who gets pulled over and can leverage media attention, there are thousands of ordinary people who experience the exact same thing in complete anonymity. Their stops don't make the news. Their complaints don't generate headlines. Their frustration doesn't spark national conversations about policing and accountability. In the end, this footage is a reminder that the law is only as fair as the people enforcing it. The Constitution guarantees equal protection. The statutes define what reasonable suspicion actually requires. The training manuals explain proper procedure. But none of that matters if the individual officer standing next to your car window decides to interpret those protections narrowly, to find suspicion where none exists, to use the vast discretion granted to law enforcement to single you out for scrutiny. Aramis Ayala knew her rights. She knew the statutes inside and out. She knew exactly what was happening during that stop, could identify the pretextual nature of it in real time, and had the professional standing to call it out without fear of retaliation. And because of that knowledge and that position, she walked away with nothing more than frustration and a viral video that sparked important conversations. But for every person like her, for every state attorney or judge or lawyer who gets pulled over and can defend themselves with expertise, there are countless others who don't have that armor, who don't have that knowledge, who don't have that platform. And that's the real tragedy hiding inside this routine traffic stop that lasted less than 2 minutes. The tragedy isn't what happened to Aramis Ayala. The tragedy is what happens every single day to everyone else who doesn't have her advantages, her expertise, or her voice. That's what should keep us up at night.